The idea that blood holds power is an ancient one that goes back to Greek mythology, and probably even before that. We use blood imagery in our religions, in our myths, even in our swear words. But if you want to use blood magic in your world, what are the things that you should think about? And how do you design a blood magic system that is engaging and still follows good world building principles? That is the topic of my conversation today. Blood magic, what it is, and how you can use it in a fantasy world. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. Today's video is brought to you by my books. I am in the process of writing an epic fantasy series called the Sangwheel Chronicles, and the first two books, The Hidden Blade and The Ducal Heir, are available on sale at all major retailers. You can hit the link to my website below and check them out there. And if you're interested, you can buy them from any of the big retailers. Last year, the royalties from my books bought me some great new lights, which I use in my studio. This year, maybe they'll buy me a camera. So if you're interested in supporting the channel, check out my books down below. Okay, enough of that. Let's crack on. So firstly, why use blood magic? It represents a real sacrifice. It represents the loss potentially of life, but at the very least of something intimately connected with a person. There is not much more intimate than that which flows through your veins. So, in terms of casting the magic, it sets good limits and it represents a real sacrifice for the price of magic. It is such a common myth in our world that it is easily believable to almost any reader. We have blood magic connected to vampirism. There is an ancient Greek curse that a witch could lay. If she was having her period and she ran around a person's house 3 times, it would lay a powerful curse on that person. If it was her first period ever, that curse would be even more powerful. So the Greeks laid store not just by blood, but by specific types of blood. And then blood magic can also be a very versatile way of making your actual magic more powerful. Not in and of itself being magic, but in providing power to existing magic. And we'll explore all of those in this video. So firstly, let's talk about how to use blood as magic. The easiest way is probably to use blood magic as a sympathetic magic. So sympathetic magic is when you use magic in an as below, so above manner. So when you have a small representation of a thing and you have a large thing and you do something to the small thing and it affects the large thing. Or you twin things. So if this thing is affected, that thing is affected. And blood magic allows you to establish that link between the two items very easily. So let's say you've got a doll that represents a person. If you get a drop of blood from the person and you add it to the doll, then you can very effectively establish that link between the two people. You can see this kind of magic in the Dresden Files. So Dresden uses blood magic quite a lot, not as itself, but in rituals to seal the circle around him or to establish links between people. The intimacy represented by blood lends itself very well to that kind of sympathetic magic. The second way in which you can use blood magic is by establishing that it is, of course, a liquid and it does contain a lot of water and iron. And there are 2 references to this that I find very interesting in its application. So the first is in Avatar: The Last Airbender with the discipline of blood bending. So waterbenders can bend someone's blood if they are sufficiently powerful, because blood does, of course, contain a large quantity of water. And this means that they can control somebody's body against their will. So this is where you're not necessarily using blood as a power source, but you're using blood in and of itself as a form of magic, in this case called blood bending. The other interesting application of this is where Magneto in the X-Men can take iron out of somebody's blood if they have sufficiently high iron content. Now, of course, you can explore that concept of the amount of iron in somebody's blood and whether people who can affect metals can therefore affect blood in a very interesting application of magic if you have an elemental type of magic system. So if you have a magic system where you've got earth type powers or powers over metals and minerals, answering the question of how much control those people have over blood is certainly a very interesting application of a magic system. And then the last application of blood magic as blood magic, not just as a power source, that I want to talk about is Legend of the Five Rings and the Mahotsukai, or the Blood Speakers. So the interesting thing about Legend of the Five Rings application is that before the fall of the Dark God, before the fall of Fu Leng, blood magic was seen as a pure, good, voluntary thing. You would ask people to sacrifice themselves to fuel the blood magic spells. And they were specific spells that could only be fueled with blood, so it wasn't just the power source. But when the Dark God fell, when the Kami Fu Leng fell, he corrupted blood magic and he made it addictive and he made it draw from the power of corruption rather than the pure power of the elemental Kami. And every spell cast also feeds Fu Leng. So you can build a whole magic system around using blood magic, not just blood as the sacrifice, but also specific spells and rituals that require you to be a blood mage. So you have both the sacrifice element and blood as magic element. And if you enjoyed that discussion around blood as magic and blood magic as not as a power source, then hit the thumbs up button and let's talk about blood as a power source and about jazzing up your current system. So in this category where you're using blood as a power source, I count the Game of Thrones blood mages, because clearly without the power of blood, you can't do what you need to do. But their magic doesn't seem to be around the blood magic as such. Blood just seems to be the power source, if that makes sense. So, in Game of Thrones, we have 3 instances that we know about where this kind of blood magic is used. The first is in Book 1 and in Season 1, where Mirri Mazdur says that she will sacrifice the horse of Khal Drogo to heal him from his wound. And of course she does, but he's stumbling around as a zombie. But building on that, we also see Daenerys sacrifice Mirri Mazdur, and that allows the dragons to be born in the funeral pyre. Now, it is my opinion that without the sacrifice of a sentient person, the dragons are born much smaller, if they are born at all. And I think that that is why dragons in a Game of Thrones world have become so much less over the centuries. Now, that is just my opinion, but it makes sense to me given everything we've seen of blood magic so far. But anyway, so you've definitely got sentient people being sacrificed to give certain magical effects. And we see that again when Melisandre sacrifices Gendry's blood, when she takes his blood using leeches and then burns those leeches in the fire. And that allows her to make those shadow warriors that she then uses to murder Stannis' younger brother. And then, of course, in season 5 of the TV series, Cersei visits a witch and that witch needs blood in order to tell her her future, which is then, that she will be supplanted by a younger queen. So in Game of Thrones, blood is the power source for magic. No blood, no power. But the type of blood does seem to matter. Like royal blood matters more. An animal's blood couldn't bring Khal Drogo back to life. Maybe a person's blood could have cured that wound. So the type of blood matters very much. But you don't have to implement your blood magic in such a way that the type of blood matters. In Codex Alera, blood magic is implemented by the canem rituals where blood is drained from sentient beings, any sentient beings. Now, the decent ritualists that haven't turned to evil, drain blood from themselves. But quantity matters in this world. So, if you want to have huge spells, if you want to have major storms or large effects, you have to drain a lot of blood. So you're going to end up killing a lot of people. So in Codex Alera, quantity matters far more than the type of blood, as long as it's sentient blood. Now, the reason why my books are sponsoring this video is because I use blood magic in my world. So in my world, blood replenishes your power if you are a troll car. If you have the ability to absorb power from blood, you can spill somebody else's blood and replenish your source of magic by absorbing the power out of that blood. If you are capable of doing this, and you then actually do it, this opens a reservoir inside you that you can fill with power taken from other people. But you will always be hungry. Even when the reservoir is completely full, you will still have that little bit of desire to pack in a little bit more, because you can pack in a little bit more and make your reservoir bigger, but that makes you more hungry in the future. And when your reservoir is empty, it is very hard for you to control your desire to fill that reservoir. It becomes an aching, hungry need, the same as you would have if you need food or if you need water. In my world, you can use human blood or animal blood, but animal blood has so little Elamar in it that you would have to kill so many animals, it's not worth it. There are, however, magical type creatures in my world that will give you more power than human blood, and that comes into play later in my stories. So that's my blood magic as I've implemented in my world. So those are examples where it is about the quantity of blood more than the type of blood. As long as the blood has the essential secret source that powers your magic, it doesn't matter whether the person is a king or a shoemaker, it's the same power that you gain from it. But in some types of blood magic, it's not actually about the blood spilt. It is about the sacrifice and the death of a sentient person. A good example of this is death curses or using the last dying energies. Mercedes Lackey does this in her world, where when a mage dies, they can use their death energy to enact some last heroic sacrifice. They can sacrifice themselves to bring about one last hurrah, one last moment of power. And you also see it in the Dresden verse by Jim Butcher, where their mages can level what is called a death curse when they die. And that death curse cannot be stopped by anything. It cannot be blocked by anything. It will always affect the target. The target can only act to mitigate that death curse. Now, in the books, Harry is in fact hit by one of these death curses, and he is cursed to die alone. And this is something that weighs on him as he proceeds through the various books. So you can certainly play around with, it's not so much blood as the end of life of a wizard. And then you can also play around with the actual sacrifice of life, like full-blown life sacrifice being valuable. And we can see this in Rick Riordan's world, where in the Heroes of Olympus, Gaia wants to sacrifice Percy and Annabeth in order to overthrow the gods. So, yes, it's a blood sacrifice, but it's not just blood. It is more about the sacrifice of the life of this entity. You're not just going to dribble some blood on the altar. You're going to slit this person's throat and end their life. And that is the sacrifice you are using to fuel your magic. So if you enjoyed talking about blood as the fuel of your magic, hit the thumbs up button. And let's consider what you need to think about when you're designing your blood magic system. First, is it blood or life or both that actually acts as the fuel? Is it important that the person dies, or is it just about the blood? And this makes quite a difference to your system. If it's just about the blood, you can make it a less dire experience. You know, people could, in theory, use blood magic without killing people, and that means that it could be a semi-good thing to use it. If it always results in people's death, it's definitely shading more towards the evil side. Like, it's hard to justify such a magic system being used for good. Is blood the actual magic, like in the case of blood bending or L5R's Mahotsukai, or is it just the fuel for the magic as it is in my world of Sangwheel Chronicles? Does the quantity of blood matter, like it does in Codex Alera, or is it just about the symbolic representation like it is in the Dresden Files? And finally, is there something that the mage can do when they're dying to use the last of their own energies to achieve something spectacular, like a death curse or a heroic sacrifice? And those were my thoughts on blood magic. If you enjoyed this video, maybe check out my video on items that channel magic and how they can influence your world. And if you want to connect around this or any other topic, I do have a Discord server. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds.